April is a cursed month in the maritime world. On April 15th of 1912, the Titanic hit an iceberg off the coast of Newfoundland and sank. There were over 2,200 people on board that fateful voyage, and more than 1,500 perished in the freezing North Atlantic waters, the most well-known maritime disaster of modern times. However, less than 50 years earlier was an even greater shipping tragedy in the southern United States. Early on April 27th of 1965, the Mississippi steamboat the Sultana exploded and sank near Memphis, Tennessee. The Sultana was carrying over 2,100 passengers, despite a limit of just 450. The Sultana sinking was estimated to have taken as many as 1,800 lives. It is often referred to as America's Titanic, although most people know that the 1912 disaster is the worst in memory. The Titanic story has been mythologized in books and on the screen, yet not as many people know about the Sultana's sinking. But why? The date of the accident might just give you a clue. Early 1865 signaled the end of the American Civil War. On April 9th, the Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to the leaders of the Union, General Ulysses S. Grant. This historical occasion effectively brought about the end of the war. The surrender alone would have taken much of the attention away from the Sultana sinking. However, just 5 days later, there was an even more momentous event, an occasion that shook the world. As a result, the Sultana disaster barely rated a mention. History buffs know the significance of April 14th, 1965. John Booth assassinated President Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C. The death of Lincoln and the subsequent chase to capture Booth was the sole focus of the news, and not just in the United States, but in a lot of the world. It pushed the surrender of the Confederate forces off of the front pages. So when 1,800 people were tragically killed in a steamboat explosion on the Mississippi, most people were just too caught up in what was happening, with the events that were shaping the American political landscape. Even though Booth was captured and killed a day before the Sultana disaster, people were still transfixed by the assassination and the closing stages of the Civil War. When you consider that well over 600,000 people were killed in the war, you can understand just how exhausted the public must have been from the constant news of bloodshed on the battlefields. Learning of more deaths in a steamboat accident was one of the last things that people wanted to hear. But for now, let's just put a spotlight back on the Sultana and see what went wrong. A significant number of eyewitnesses and written records have given us a fairly clear idea of events leading up to the explosion of boilers below the ship. And just as in the aftermath of the Titanic, the finger-pointing and the blame game soon began. The Sultana was headed from Vicksburg, Mississippi to Illinois. It was an 80-meter-long, 3-decked steamboat that was originally built for the cotton trade. With the onset of the Civil War, the Sultana was primarily used to transport troops and supplies up and down the Mississippi. The legal limit was 376 people, with an extra 80 crew members. When Lincoln was shot on April 15th, the Sultana was docked in Cairo, Illinois. Captain James Mason immediately set off down the river to New Orleans and the intent of spreading the news. Due to the war, telecommunications had broken down, and Mason realized the news and his reputation as a hardy captain could be spread more easily by boat. The Sultana then stopped off at Vicksburg, where Mason ran into Captain Reuben Hatch. Hatch was a Union officer and had a sizable number of Union prisoners ready to be shipped back home for release, noting that the U.S. government was paying for the shipping of prisoners back to their homes in the North. $5 a man, in fact. Mason did the math, and I liked what he came up with. He readily agreed to ship as many men as he could, although there was a condition. Captain Hatch wanted his cut of the action, which, obviously, Mason readily agreed to. The Sultana thus continued down to New Orleans, spreading the news of Lincoln's death, before returning to Vicksburg and picking up the released prisoners. Mason didn't hold back. He crammed as many men as he could into the steamboat. When Sultana had finally set off for St. Louis, it was kind of heaving under the weight of 2,500 people on board, roughly 2,000 over the limit. The steamboat was also nursing a damaged boiler. On the way from New Orleans to Vicksburg, the Sultana's engineers had noticed a leak in one of the 4 boilers that needed immediate repairing. When they stopped off at Vicksburg, they decided to quickly patch it up and later fix it properly once they were back in Illinois. With all that figured out, the Sultana hauled itself up the Mississippi, with passengers crammed into every possible nook and cranny, and with a boiler on its last legs. It was also April, which meant the chances of strong flood currents in the river were very high, and come they did. With so many men on board the Sultana, any movement on the deck meant that the boat shifted weight suddenly. This was extremely dangerous because boilers below were losing water from the rocking above. However, the boilers were still being heated up by the furnaces. When the Sultana stopped shifting and the water splashed back into the boilers, they steamed up, causing a huge change in pressure. This perfect storm meant that the boilers were under a massive strain with the river currents and overcrowded decks. Something had to go, and something did. On April 27th at around 2 a.m. just outside of Memphis, 3 of the 4 Sultana boilers suddenly burst into a huge eruption. The middle of the steamboat was ripped to shreds, and hundreds of passengers sleeping above the boilers were killed instantly. Survivors described the explosion as being like a volcano. Hundreds of people were thrown into the dark rapids, with most being completely unable to swim, and they drowned. The blast furthermore sent shards of shrapnel all across the decks, killing even more passengers. Wind then set the steamboat on fire and collapsed onto its side, throwing additional people into the water. Those who could scrambled to cling onto debris and battled their way to the shore. Not long after the explosion, the steamboat Bostona arrived on the scene. Crew and passengers on the Bostona started throwing timber, chairs, whatever they could that would float into the water to give struggling survivors something to hold on to, a chance. By daylight, most of the people who were rescued were safely on shore. The rapid currents of the river had taken the bodies of the dead very, very far away, and most were never accounted for. 786 people were taken to the hospital, and the remaining bodies were lined up on the shore to be put into coffins. An investigation into the causes of the disaster soon got underway. The Sultana's Captain Mason died in the explosion, so the blame was shifted towards those responsible for loading up the steamboat with prisoners. A judge found the Union officer Captain Hatch to be largely responsible. However, Hatch went into hiding and was never arrested or even brought to trial. America's Titanic story avoided mass attention because of other events, as we already mentioned, that took place at the same time. It was not opportune. However, a positive note can be taken from all of the disastrous sinking. Most of the rescuers that night were Confederate folks, helping Union soldiers to safety. They were able to put aside their differences and heroically rescue vulnerable men regardless of their creed. They rescued men, they rescued women, they rescued children, even former soldiers who were in peril. And in many ways, it proved to be a sign of better times and moving on with life as fellow countrymen.